Urinating in the reactor coolant was Garrett's first action after being marooned. Garrett believed the base owed him something after spending 36 hours going in circles within a dilapidated alien repair station where no one answered his communications, and every console flickered in error languages he didn't understand. The coolant line was heated, and hydration recycling was not operational. It smelt faintly like citrus, which he found oddly reassuring, and hissed like a dying tea kettle. I bet the diagnostics won't show that to the Zarks. He chewed on the same dried meat ration he had been eating since yesterday as he zipped up and resumed his methodical patrol across the North Maintenance Ring. The artificial substance tasted like brine-soaked plastic, yet it included protein. His greatest resources were now time and protein. Outpost 17 Beta's reluctant visitor is Garrett Lorn, a Class B hull engineer and trained shipboard mechanic. 4 of the most bureaucratic members of the Galactic Accords were to work together to preserve the location as an interspecies refueling facility. It was a miracle of interspecies collaboration in theory, but in reality it had fewer working systems than a Neolithic cave and more rust than an Earthside scrapyard. He had been abandoned during the evacuation. He couldn't tell whether that was a clerical error or something more intentional. The humans hired under temporary repair allowances weren't exactly given regular reports by Zark's authority. Without the man in the crawl space reconfiguring their waste filtration logic, the aliens had fled in less than an hour after becoming alarmed by a long-range scanner anomaly and packing their shuttles with servers and biocore data, Garrett said. To himself, you can't evacuate what you don't log. He walked past a broken interface panel, which had been pulled off in a hurry by someone who likely believed it contained something significant. Garrett narrowed his eyes at the wiring. The base was still powered, although dimly and flickeringly. Thus, the core remained intact. Although they were delicate, fusion reactors weren't lethal. The entire station didn't need to be dismantled. If the reactor was stable, unless maintenance had been neglected for 6 months or 6 years, Garrett went into the old bay for hydroponics. This sector had originally been lush, or at least somewhat lush, thanks to the station's environmental systems. It was quiet now. Vines hung brittle and brown over long, dry irrigation troughs. Lights overhead flickered in failed patterns, and the stench was a cross between decaying kelp and stale metal. After standing there for a while, he moved towards the main environmental hub. Although the console's design was strange, he was accustomed to servicing hybrid systems. In order to simplify cross-rail logistics, the Third Accord Convention standardized the trottle interface and redundant circuitry. He used his boot knife to pry open the access panel. Wires drooped like intestines beneath the console. The majority were fused or misrouted, perhaps to divert air to one of the more vital sectors during the evacuation. Someone had done a shoddy patch job. Perhaps they hadn't thought anyone would ever return. Garrett spliced and rerouted over the next 3 hours, saying out loud, "Good news, your thermostat's only mostly fried." He used spools of connection line he had scrounged from the wreckage of the shuttle bay and wire from an old door servo. He allowed the hydro loop to rely on ambient thermals instead of the core. Temperature regulator. It would cycle again, though it would not be optimal. The hum may have reappeared since the moisture reclamator might possibly turn back on. It began as a gentle floor vibration before rising, lively and resonant. There was a brief hiss of water, spraying from a torn seam, and the first irrigation line pulsed. In spite of himself, Garrett smiled. He clicked his communication station log timestamp, which read 167 by Accord standard, with the primary loop A6 operational and the environmental subsystem largely repaired. This brings an end to my incredibly solitary TED lecture. No answer, of course. With a sudden awareness of the silence, he wandered back into the hallway. There had been boots on grates, shouting in 6 languages, and the clatter of servicing. Drones in the early days of his contract. Silence now. He sensed a quiet. The base was forgotten, not just damaged. However, forgotten was not a category that a mechanic's mind could comprehend. The machines just failed. They didn't forget. Garrett had spent his entire life repairing malfunctioning devices. On level 3, he discovered an unlooted storage room. It included 3 full canisters of filtered air, 2 sealed ration boxes, a collapsed cleaning bot, and spare circuit boards. He pulled the crates into a small transit terminal and made camp there. The silver-black gleam of the planet's upper atmosphere was just visible via a long, curved window on one side of the room. As a storm passed across the horizon below, Garrett sat against the wall and chewed in silence. Thin, arcing strands of lightning flickered. As he watched it, he experienced an odd serenity. No one was returning for the station. Therefore, it didn't need to be in working order. Search crews and evacuation shuttles were absent from the manifest. The entire operation had likely been written off as a fiscal casualty, possibly even scuttled by the Accord. However, Garrett was still alive. And well, additionally, each cable, switch, and screw on this foundation had been designed to accomplish a specific task. The machine still wanted to operate, even though the galaxy didn't care. He got up. He had time, tools, power, and a long list of things that ought to be functioning. He would begin with the reactor room tomorrow. That night, Garrett didn't really sleep, with creaking metal joints, expanding and contracting with heat shifts, and venting air from an unknown source. The station moaned excessively. It was like having a building-sized asthmatic animal in the same room as you, while the faint blue glow is still. He was already up as the morning cycle continued, squeezing his toolkit shut and tying the remaining wire coils into a makeshift belt. Everything else would be simple if the core was intact, but if not, he would have to figure out how to avoid blowing up. It was going to be a productive morning, anyway. The reactor wing was located past 2 tiers of biometric locks, a dropship's blast door, and 3 blast-shielded floors. With no power and no one remaining to approve anything, the biometric layers were now dead. But the door 10 inches of composite armor made to resist orbital bombardment remained unyielding. Garrett chewed a piece of jerky methodically while standing in front of it. He recalled that beneath there was a maintenance tunnel that was initially intended for inspecting coolant overflow. When the AOI began to mistake human odors for system breaches, something about protein chains setting off hazard sensors, the Zark's engineers had walled it off. Rerouting the humans completely above ground had been the solution. Normal, he located the old vent shaft, went back to level -2, and jumped in. The tunnel was sticky with ancient residue that smelt like melted batteries, narrow, and obviously not designed for human shoulders. He had to drag his load with him and crawl the majority of the trip. The core was visible when the shaft opened into the lower reactor alcove after 20 meters. It had a low, vibrant, yet unhappy hum. On its outside, faint warning lights flashed, red for temperature variation, offline for backup regulators, fail-safe for power cycling. The energy consumption of the entire station was lower than that of a civilian escape pod. Garrett opened the panel while kneeling next to the primary interface node. Yes, alien wiring, but he had done worse. After mapping out the circuits, he used thermocouple clamps from a burned-out server hub to circumvent the corroded junction box that was the source of the malfunction. While working, he muttered to himself to fill the air rather than for companionship. Cold junctions are dead, which explains her limp. That's just luck and bubble wrap, not even shielding. He manually reset the core to stable mode, redirected its feed to the thermal coupler, and pried open the connection. The lights in the reactor wavered, steadied, and blinked once. Panels across. The alcove were illuminated in a cascade. Readouts were updated in real time, and energy flows were changed and recalibrated as the hum intensified. The heart of the station was pounding once more. Garrett took a deep breath and leaned back against the wall. He watched there for a few minutes. The reactor was no longer limping. Some lights were still out. Some modules were not responding. But it was functioning, stable, if under... Not because anyone would read it, but because that's what you do when you bring something back to life. He took a datapad out of his bag and started writing down repairs. By drawing a distinction between before and after, you created a record. As soon as he stood up, he switched through the subsystems. Link once more. Tight and unresponsive air filtering system. Although not ideal, gravity modulation is functional. Still no long-range communications, despite the flashing mistakes. The docking bay pressure sensors were at least blinking, and for Garrett, blinking represented hope. Dirty but energized, he climbed back out of the crawl space. The base was waking up, not merely functioning. Over the course of the following 3 days, Garrett resinced the crew quarter heating coils, restarted the water recyclers, and jury-rigged a fuel gauge bypass. He used bits of hull insulation to replace broken lights, deactivated drone armor to patch pressure breaches, and salvaged parts from 6 dead consoles to assemble a functional one. He slept in a hammock he constructed out of wire netting and fire-resistant fabric, and he consumed cold ration bars. His eyes were red and his beard was uneven and sprouting, but he felt better than he had in months. For once, he was creating something new, even if it was out of trashens, that of just repairing what others had damaged. The drones followed. The first one, an S-class maintenance unit intended for hull inspections, was dormant and lacking its leg modules when he discovered it in a storage closet. It resembled a horseshoe crab upside down with a torch attached to its face. He pulled it out, connected its motor cortex to a diagnostic loop, and repaired the power cell. After a single, double, and final click, it raised its head. "Welcome back," answered Garrett. "Hope you're not homicidal." The drone studied him before emitting a lengthy tone. Enough. He reactivated 2 additional drones over the remainder of the day. One whirled in circles with a shattered optics array, while the other could hardly hover but beeped merrily any time it came close to Garrett. He gave them the names Torque, Blip, and Lefty. By the 4th day, they were carrying tools and replacement parts while following him throughout the hallways. As he rewired the atmospheric scrubbers, he trained Torque to hold a light steady. Blip learnt how to perform system checks, but Lefty mainly simply ran into stuff. It was functioning, but it was ridiculous. The base had transformed from a ruin to a machine once more, with Garrett at its core. The 6th day began with a slight tremor, enough to cause Garrett to pause in the middle of his bite and look up at the com tower ceiling, where dust was sifting idly through a broken vent. Torque's gyro was unsteady, and he chirped and spun twice in place. Like a terrified animal, Blip ducked behind the closest bench. Garrett got up and chewed the last of his protein bar slowly, He used his jumpsuit to clean his hands before tapping. The terminal he had repaired from a fragment of cafeteria wall and half a navigation console. It came from inside, he said, referring to the seismic log, which showed no entry. No alerts in the station's internal sensors, no external events. Recorded no inbound ships, and no geological instability from the planet below. He didn't like surprises, not here, not when everything was changing. Yet the tremor had seemed deep and far away, almost like pressure shifting in an old pipe. Else was humming along now. The base schematics were called up, because no one wanted to fix it. A large portion of the lower tier remained red-zoned and marked as inaccessible, which most likely meant broken. Despite its weakness, the seismic wave appeared to have come from somewhere below sublevel. Garrett turned to face Blip. Time for a field trip. None of the usual routes included sublevel 8. They had to squeeze through a half-welded doorframe that had been sealed since long before Garrett had arrived, avoid a fallen goods shaft, and navigate a vent passage that had obviously once been home to some kind of voracious mold. Even Blip had given up following by the time he got to the hall, choosing instead to loiter nervously just out of sight. Garrett took a solitary step forward, as if something electrical had vented, and continued to vent for days. The walls of the corridor were charred. The floor had faint scratches that resembled drag marks, or perhaps they were caused by an overloaded tire being dragged through quickly. There were no buzzes or flickers, only blackness and the smell of static. His shoulder lamp flashed on. The corridor led to a little square room beyond. There were no drone ports, storage boxes, or operational terminals here, just a floor hatch with the Zark's ragged script on it. One of the words he recognized was containment. Garrett knelt next to it. The original magnetic locks that locked the hatch were no longer powered. He used a low-frequency probe to check the frame. There were no traps or recent activity, but the lock was reinforced rather than original. Long after the base had lost interest, someone had wanted this closed. After deliberating, Garrett snorted to himself. He took a micro-cutter from his belt, inserted it into the seam, and began cutting, saying, "I'm a mechanic, not a philosopher." A final hiss of displaced air, ancient, dry, and chilly, opened the hatch. A drop shaft, perhaps 10 meters below the surface. He landed in what seemed to be a data vault after descending from the drone bay using a line spool, black pillars, servers of some sort, and the slightest hint of residual charge hummed throughout the area. A towering, sealed cylinder at the far end was connected to the floor by dozens of cables. Garrett came slowly. A pod, fortified, armored and suspended in a field of insulating gel that had dried and broken over time. The cylinder was more than just storage. One of the auxiliary lines was still taking a trickle from the station core, but the power cell that was connected to it was long dead. He looked over the markings. Some had the triangle glyphs employed in Zark military designations prior to the collapse, but none were in accord standard. Why would they store a military pod under a fuel depot? He grumbled. He tracked the connections and found that several of them linked to sealed protocols and blocked subsystems that he was unaware of. And why keep it running after everything else got pulled? He said. Others vanished into areas the schematics had never charted, into the bulkhead behind the pod. He thought about turning on the backup, but decided against it. Rather, he carefully and slowly removed the auxiliary power feed before recording the event on his pad with his personal ID and a timestamp. The chamber grew dimmer as the pod completely shut down. For now, Whatever was here would remain here. Garrett returned to the higher floors by a longer route, checking for visible damage from the tremor. Blip, who looked like a question mark with wings, reconnected with him halfway up the stairway, and exuded optimism. He spent the evening rerouting power from the shut basement vault. "I don't know what we just found," Garrett remarked, "but it wasn't meant for me." For the first time since arriving, he was able to bring the forward comes dish out of hibernation mode thanks to the additional energy. As it realigned, as if it hadn't moved in years, the thing shuddered. He used pieces from an abandoned drone housing to repair a damaged rotary gear that occurred during the adjustment. Sort of, the signal boost worked. Despite not receiving any messages from the Accord, he detected a slight ping. It was a 3-second burst that was repeated every 2 minutes from somewhere outside the fourth moon. It wasn't regular traffic or a distress call. Just a ping, no encryption or signature. After logging it, Garrett looked at Blip. Garrett triangulated the signal for the next 2 days, concluding, someone's out there. Like a blind man clicking in a cave, he bounced the pings off dead satellites and stationed debris as he swept the outer moons with the device. The end outcome was laborious, painstaking work. The signal's 3-second burst and delay remained constant. It was only a pulse. It had no language, no data, and no audio. Garrett didn't enjoy being seen, and it was either purposeful and watching or old and broken. He created a probability map of the origin of each ping by recording it into a rolling file. A long-abandoned mining platform stuck in a deteriorating orbit around the fourth moon served as the pattern's focal point. It shouldn't be broadcasting anything because, according to the registers, it was decommissioned more than 10 years ago and none of the previous residents had claimed it after the evacuation. Bumbling. "Time to make a call," Garrett said, rerouting. Auxiliary power. He climbed back up to the deck of the main cum and accomplished what he had been dreading for the past 2 weeks. He broadcast a long-range signal into space. It would have been hopeful of him to ask for assistance. Neither did he bother with diplomacy. He sent a concise, straight message to the person who had been sending the ping. He broadcast it on all of the main frequencies, then waited for an hour, then 2. Unknown transmitter. "This is technician Garrett Lorn of Accord Outpost 17 Beta. I have reactivated the station. I've detected your signal. Respond or cease transmission. You're spooking the drones." No answer. The ping then stopped on the 3rd hour. It just stopped, neither replaced nor corrupted. 6 more hours passed before Garrett spoke again, this time explicitly addressing the stillness. "I've closed the basement vault's confinement. What's down there, I know. I had no intention of touching it. Your interest, whatever it may be, is not mine." No response once more. However, motion was seen on the long-range scanner the following morning. 3 ships, then 7, then 1 blip. No approach, vectors, or broadcast IDs. Simply a quiet, unannounced, and closing presence. Watching the screen on the monitor above his station, Garrett stood in the main hallway. They weren't scavengers, and they weren't Accord. Too organized, too spotless. Mostly to himself, he murmured, "They're coming for the vault." He turned on all of the internal surveillance drones by tapping a command key. Blip and Torque rushed into action. After hitting one wall, Lefty turned around and struck the other wall. After grinning, Garrett began to secure the recently fixed bulkheads. He had no intention of fighting. It was a story for another day. He was not going to make things simple, though. The station's halls were frigid, and the lights were lowered by the time the first boarding party arrived. unusual buzzing patterns, from automated servos distracted from the important areas. In order to deceive body scanning, Blip released trace heat signals. Two of the intruders slipped and collided after Lefty spread a full can of black repair foam on a stairwell. Meanwhile, Garrett had moved into the vault shaft, with one hand on the manual reactivation switch and the other holding a datapad containing the gearbox logs. He stood next to the dormant pod. The corridor upstairs was reached by the first of the attackers. Backlit by an alien visor, the figure stopped at the hatch. Garrett remained unflinching. He stated, "This isn't your station." The figure walked forward without saying anything. When Garrett flipped a breaker, the pod hissed, ejecting the core wire into the wall rather than opening. In a flash, the entire system shorted. Containment field disintegrated and surged. There would be no more power for the capsule within. Garrett remarked, "You're not getting it," as he turned to look directly at the figure. The figure took another stride and then halted, saying, "You don't even know what it is." Blip buzzed to life behind it, letting out a sudden high-pitched distressed tone, one that was deliberately engineered to mimic a reactor leak. The emergency lights came on. In the confusion, the boarding party scurried. The figure retreated and vanished into the smoke. Garrett sealed the shaft and walked out of the vault chamber. The ships had started to retreat by the time he made his way back to the surface deck. There were no explosions or gunfire, only a silent retreat, as if something had changed and they could no longer understand it. No weapon had unsettled them. More than a man standing unarmed and alone in front of a reactor pod. He rebuilt during the course of the following week. The vault was still closed. He stripped the cabling, unplugged the power supplies, and used the area to keep spare tools. He created a hydroponics chamber at the forward dormitory. Although it grew slowly, the food was dependable. The drones grew in number. After Blip gained experience handling diagnostics without Garrett's guidance, the station resumed broadcasting. A silent looping message that reads, "This station is active, repaired, functional. Crew 1 awaiting assignment," rather than a ping or distress call. With his legs hanging over the grating, Garrett sat on the edge of the previous viewport, which was now clear and uncluttered. He was not going anywhere. Once lifeless, the station was now alive. Perhaps the fact that a mechanic was able to make it function was sufficient.